Greetings, debate bros. Welcome back to Disenthrall. I will be Patrick Smith. Today we have a really cool conversation with a couple really cool people about whether or not it's efficacious to spend time arguing with people towards liberty. Let's get into it. He has a plan, she has a plan, and you get to pay for it regardless.
The best way to get someone motivated is to stand for something strongly, deeply, passionately.
Subscribe to Disenthrall.
Do as you're told.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Multiple time returning guest Jeremy and multiple time guest now Jack. He's been on Anarchast and Disenthrall now. It's great to have you both. Jack, how are you?
I'm doing awesome. How about you?
Doing good, man. I'm looking forward to this one. Jeremy, how about you? How you been? I know you've been through some real shit lately with the SEC. How are you? How's it hanging?
Good. Yeah, all good, and I'm excited to be having this conversation. I think it'll be a fun and interesting conversation, and I'm even willing to be persuaded, which is an ironic thing to say at the beginning, but I am here willing to be persuaded.
Yeah, the reason why I invited you both, and I don't want to bury the lead, and we'll get into it shortly, but the reason why I'm interested is because this is a big part of what I'm trying to do here with this channel and other channels, and I'm trying to learn how to convince people better towards liberty, and I'm trying to share those methods with people, like Larkin Rose does with his Candles in the Dark seminar, things like that. There's people out there that are putting forward their ideas on how to convince people and how to create more libertarians. And if that's futile to any degree, I want to learn that so that I can better interface with reality. I want my internal model of reality to match as closely as possible to how it actually is. So let's get into this. It began on Twitter with a video. Let me play the clip, and then we'll get into Jack's response and set this up.
What I'm saying is you weren't reasoned into being a libertarian. You weren't. It's something that you needed to see the right kind of argument to expose it to you, and it made it click for you if you hadn't heard the ideas before. But it was not like there's not some generic. This is why the Libertarian Party, in my opinion, continues to fail, because it has this idea that we can persuade the majority of Americans to be libertarian, and our political beliefs are not that persuadable. Like the reason that people have sort of socialist style beliefs is because they want certain outcomes, and they don't care about the means to getting them, and they're not going to necessarily buy into they're not going to buy into them. So it's not. It's closer to something like, what kind of ice cream do you like, in terms of how do you want to live your life and what kind of government do you like? And it's not this kind of thing that's like a math equation where there's this objectively correct answer.
To which Jack responded, he is completely wrong. You can persuade people once you find what key pieces of propaganda rule them. I've been doing this work for years, and I've done so successfully, from Anarchy Ball to the Philosopher to the Honest Teacher. Tens of millions of impacts, mass cultural change of people knowing taxation is theft and engaging with libertarian ideas. Others have been wildly successful in this too, from Dave Smith to Michael Malice to Eric July to Zuby. It's sad to promote these false ideology because you're deceiving other people into believing they cannot change people and change the culture. I'll leave it there. I think that's a good enough summary. And let me give it to Jack first. Is there anything in that you want to change, walk back, reinforce, expand on, and then we'll give it to Jeremy to maybe respond? Because, look, the first thing I do on Twitter when we start to actually have a meaningful discussion is invite people to get the hell off Twitter, so that we can maybe have a more meaningful one. So here we are. Let's do it.
Yeah, nothing to walk back on, just to add on there, just to reemphasize in contextualization. The first thing he said in his video, where he said, convince the majority, or close to majority of people to become libertarian. I think that as a goal in and of itself is not really a necessity. We're talking about at least the political arena, right? Politics in terms of participation, is a whole different thing versus total adult population, total registered voters, total people who then just choose to vote and stuff like that. But I would go as far to say that even there, with the right tactics and tools, yes, you could, by and large, convince quite a few people to change their minds, just depending on tools, tactics, presentation, person.
Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it would be good to kind of talk through more specifically, what my actual claims are, and then kind of see where we agree and disagree in a sort of more fine-grained way, right? And so, yeah, I obviously am not making the claim that persuasion can't happen. That would be really easy to refute because we're all here and we're all persuaded, right? So if we experience persuasion, you sort of have a Descartesian argument. Well, what happened to us? so surely it could happen to others. I would note that if you look at the sort of archetype of a libertarian, they tend to have high openness to experience. They tend to be more systemizing thinkers. And that, what you're really talking about is, well, the people who manage to be persuaded to libertarians are basically the class of people who are capable of engaging in abstract discussion of ideas and reasoning about them, which is already, in my view, probably under 10% of the population, certainly under 20% of the population. So then what do we mean by persuasion? So when I say persuasion is fake, what I really mean is that you're not going to change people's minds with that kind of these kinds of intellectual arguments. The things that made you a libertarian aren't going to engage others. My claim is not that you could not find a way of getting other people to profess a belief in libertarianism. But to the extent that you could do that, it is not going to be the sort of, if you look at, again, most libertarians, not all, but almost all libertarians were intellectually persuaded to libertarianism, usually by, if you made a list, by about 5 to 10 names, although there's certainly a long tail. But that's how people came. But that's those same things aren't going to work on others. So what do you think about that? What was your path, Jack? How did you become a libertarian, Jack? Was there a material, book that you read, or a video you saw that set you down the path?
Sure. Sorry, did you say something, Patrick? Your voice went, but I didn't hear anything.
Yeah, I was gonna point out this new class of people that I discovered, over the past several years at Anarchapulco. It's a total, Jeremy mentioned this systematizing, NT type personality, to use the 4-letter personality codes. Most libertarians seem to fall into that NT personality type that I interact with. But then I go to Anarchapulco, and it's just this vast swath of feels-based, definitely not systematic thinkers, and I don't mean that in an insulting way necessarily, that have been convinced towards liberty somehow. I don't understand how, but somebody did it. So yeah, I think that was a good question to Jack, though. I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, I just want to make sure I didn't miss it because it just mouth went, but the voice didn't come through. So piggybacking off of what you just said, there's a difference in the libertarian spectrum of being someone who's fully conversant in history and the philosophy and economics, and someone who has just started down the path. So when you just mentioned how, I started down the path. So I was a neoconservative, and my family, when I was growing up, was messianic neoconservative, and as far as I had known, that was my kind of worldview bubble. That's all that was presented to me in school, and I had no idea about all the ills of government. I just thought, oh, it's a good thing, right? It's there to protect us, and you wouldn't have thought otherwise about where I would have gone with that if it wasn't for the fact that when I was in my undergraduate in my history class, the professor talked about the case of Buck v. Bell, where Carrie Buck was forcibly sterilized under Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough because the American eugenics program was very rampant in the early 1900s. I think this was happening around 1927. So I was shocked by that. I was like, wait, what? No one ever taught me this in school. What the heck? What are you talking about? That's something that, the people over in Germany did in the 1930s and 40s. America? What? So I had to look into this, and I started to do research into this and look into the history. And I started to revisit everything I knew because I was just so shocked at this. It contradicted my worldview and my knowledge so greatly that it left an impact on me. And so I went down the path of different things over time. At the time, this is in the 06 to 08 arena. Alex Jones is probably one of the bigger ones to check out all these things. So ran into his stuff and Obama deception, other things like that. And I started to come to terms with the fact that what I had been taught about American history was not true at all. And that was really perturbing for me. It was later on where I started to actually get into libertarian philosophy and come across people who were talking about those things. A little bit later on, a little bit of Ron Paul, Mark Stevens of the No State Project, reading Lysander Spooner, John Hosness and stuff like that. But for me, it was that pilling moment, that one fact that sent me reeling and saying, wait, no, that can't be true. And having to check that catapulted me down all of this, that we're now in today with, crazy ad caps. So, it wasn't some book, even libertarian literature. I didn't even have that in school, which is kind of weird to think about because a lot of times young people might be like, oh yeah, I read Fountainhead, or, oh, I watched a Milton Friedman video, or maybe I read, Bossett's Law in school. Cause even that sometimes here and there, I taught, public schools, and I saw that, sometimes kids would get Ayn Rand exposure or something. I didn't get that. I didn't get any of it. Me, I had, Ann Coulter and Michael Savage and Michelle Malkin. That was the people who were around then. So definitely nothing near liberty oriented. And, that change for me really also opened up my eyes into thinking about how to change other people's minds, because a big part of that is that limited discourse and that Overton window and that programming. And it made me see that when you can get others who have a certain cemented belief or worldview, if you can get others to have something that shocks their senses enough that it makes them question everything else, you can send someone down that rabbit hole and start to really get them to question their beliefs. And it doesn't take a great intellectual to do this. I know a lot of libertarians are intellectually minded. There's a lot of rational thinkers, but it doesn't take that, because this type of trauma and this type of change, this shift, can be intellectual in terms of a fact, or it could be physical and experiential. There are many people who go down this path because they had a bad interaction with a police officer, and it suddenly made like, what the heck? Why? I thought the cops were there to protect us, and they have a change. It could be something like in the lockdowns, with the government shutting stuff down and the riots going on, people calling the police saying, yeah, there's riots going on. They're like, yeah, you're on your own, right? And they're like, wait, what? You know what I mean? What are you talking about? I'm on my own. You're the cops. You're supposed to help. And these types of traumatic events, or these types of shocking facts, are sufficient to start to unravel the years of programming and the brainwashing trauma that exists through that, kind of traumatized government, molding of minds that happens in the public school paradigm, which is, what really government does is they're really great at trauma bonding students to those experiences and getting them to think that government's it, baby. And, that's all you got. And if you try to get anything else, that's chaos, that's anarchy. So that's really my passion. And that's my focus when I think about those things. Other people have different things. I think Patrick, mentioned wonderfully how Anarchapulco is a great example of more of the F types, the feeling type people who are attracted to liberty. But I think there is something to be said about how you can wake people up with a new type of trauma, a new type of a shock that causes them to question their fundamental worldview.
All right, so Jack wants us to traumatize everybody to make more libertarians. That's the strategy. Jeremy, is this like a nature nurture thing? Do you believe in free will, or are you determinist? I'm more of a determinist, and how does that play into this? Are you arguing at that level, or are you more up at the look, it's like genetic? Or what? Tell me more about your position.
I do believe in free will, simply because I think that choice dominates the others. You're better off believing in free will, whether it's real or not. But if you did a little game theory matrix, it's just, well, you should believe in free will whether it exists or not. That's just the correct choice. But I think the genetic part of it is very interesting to me. And certainly that is a lot of the material that I consumed that made me, that changed some of my views about this. Although in my case, I think it helped the world make more sense to me. So I'm going to go down that and let me explain some of those things. I do want to say quickly that Jack, when Jack's answer there, Jack was, he was very curious and he had a desire for consistency, right? And those, I think, are the kinds of attributes that lead someone to be capable of being persuaded to libertarianism. But yes, so let's talk about that. So I guess, how did I get started on this stuff? Probably with Steven Pinker's book, the Blank Slate book, when I was in my early 20s. But this is material I've continued to consume since then. And we have some very interesting studies. We have studies of identical twins, where the identical twins were separated at birth, were raised in different families, and then social scientists measured their attitudes about things. And they found that basically everything is heritable. Not only the traditional things that we think of as heritable, like height and eye color and these kinds of things, right? No one really questions that. No one's really shocked when the son of the professional basketball player went on to be a professional basketball player. But they found it for literally everything. So much so that I think it's a guy named Turkheimer, has 3 laws of behavioral genetics. The first is that all traits are heritable. Literally every aspect of humanity is heritable. The second law is that the effect of being raised in the same family is less than the effect of the genes. In the case of this research, this is called the shared environment. So, the non-shared environment is basically the environment that's private to you and your family. So people in the same zip code share an environment. In your own family is a non-shared environment. But basically, and then a substantial portion of the variation is this shared environment. Effectively, you could think of it as something like the zip code that you grew up in, although it's not exactly that. But it's basically the things that you and others in your community would have been experiencing. And very, very consistently, for literally everything, it doesn't matter how weird it is. Like, we think whether it's homosexuality or whether you dislike homosexuality, like, we find the same thing, that genetics is number one, and then there's these shared and non-shared environments, where frequently the shared environment, the zip code, is ranking above even the family environment. And this data comes from taking identical twins who were separated, and how did they come out? And then they measured their attitudes, there's all kinds of things about them. And so, look, I wouldn't have thought this stuff was true. I didn't go out like being convinced of this before I found it. But I found this stuff, and the data it seems very solid to me. And it also does fit with the world. It explains a lot of things in terms of why things are the way that they are. So, yeah, I don't know. What do you think of? Well, I guess, what do you think of this subject? Have you looked into these twin studies? Do you find this stuff credible, implausible, irrelevant?
I'm just so glad you brought those studies up, because I'm about to chop them all up. So when it comes to the twin studies, there's a lot of different study bias and framing errors here. One of those framing bias errors is that when you're measuring twins and their separation, there's no controls for what it is of the type of exposure and home environment they had, in particular, what type of similar schooling situations, home life situations, and political orientations they were exposed to, the mass media cultural orientation, so on and so forth. So these are what are called dipping stick tests. They're essentially going, oh, we're going to just look at the outcome and that's it. They're not longitudinal studies and observation, which means direct observation over all these people and the influencing factors over them. And so because of that, it would be an improper statistical framing error to actually make an is-ought out of this. The is might be simply that, oh, okay, a person might have genetic influences that might lead to some certain outcomes, especially if they have shared different types of common experiences in schooling and so on and so forth, mass media and parenting styles. However, that doesn't tell you anything about what information they've been exposed to and what type of experience they've been exposed to that would otherwise change those things. So in other words, simply saying, hey, maybe there's some genetic shared traits doesn't actually speak to whether or not there is something that changes those. These people are not studying whether there's an outside influence of specific form and what observationally those changes lead to and the efficacies of those. So that's kind of the first framing bias issue that you have there. Then we also have.
I want to understand because I don't understand why that would debunk it. If you have twins who are separated in birth, and you can say that, wow, it seems to matter more that the twin had conservative genetic parents rather than the liberal parents who actually raised the twin, that we can see that correlated more than the political attitudes of the parent doing the raising. Why would that not be informative to see that like if we can see that beliefs seem to correlate more with the genetic parent than the parent who raised the child, even though the genetic parent wasn't in the life of the child, didn't interact with the child. Why I don't understand why that wouldn't be a relevant fact.
Moose over on Odysee, thanks for the super chat. He says, "Have you seen Jack?" I've seen Jack in a mullet. That's enough trauma to make everybody an ANCAP. Okay. All right. Sorry, Jack. Go ahead.
So again, what you're saying has to be in context, right? In context of something, you would have to say, oh, okay, this is true every time and for all time, right? So when you have a study, you can't simply say, oh, okay, well, we measured them at 18 or 21 or 25, and oh, that's it. They happen to have this conservative view. You'd have to actually have longitudinal change and also the information to know whether or not there is something that would actually change those views. Again, this is a dipping stick problem where you're saying, oh, okay, well, maybe they're a little more conservative with liberal parents. But saying liberal parents does not tell us the totality of their life. It doesn't tell us what information they're exposed to, what their schooling was like, and the experiences there. It doesn't tell you actually a whole host of epigenetic factors that would, especially in shared cultural context, potentially lead to similar outcomes. And I think you actually probably would know this in a very good example, right? And this might tie to a later discussion, but right, social contagion and kids suddenly all coming out as, trans together as a bunch of girls, right, in this classroom. You understand that in that context, you could have immediately social influences of people identifying a certain way due to social contagion with, of course, young people trying to fit in. So these types of changes.
But we're not. I'm not an absolutist. I'm not claiming that it's like that. Obviously, environment does matter. You see social phenomena and you see all these things. The question is, what matters more, right? And so that's I'm definitely not following why. And by the way, there are longitudinal twin studies as well. But even regardless of that, I do not follow at all why it would not be meaningful data, even if you literally have a sample at an arbitrary time t, right? You still, if people are blank slates, right, or closer to blank slates, then your expectation would be that the ideology of children would match the environment in which they were raised. So, if you see that this difference between genetic children, I need a better word for this, but a child who matches the genetics of their parents. Because I do support adopt. By the way, I grew up with an adopted sister. I support this isn't like I'm not like this is an adopting kind of belief here. But if we see that these differences. That really does seem meaningful to me. And say, oh yeah, you could say people might change later, et cetera, but it doesn't matter. The question is, because we're talking about something that's multivariate, that's multi-causal. The question is there some? But do you think are you all the way to blank slate? Like people are blank slates, or you just think genetics is less than I'm saying that it is?
No, well, because I think that it's not a proper framing to think of these particular things within genetic, non-genetic. We're talking about specific ideas, right? Because it's like a computer talking hardware versus software, right? Hardware is what your body is doing to your full capacity of your processing and possibly even some emotional proclivities and other things like that, due to your total complex of all your different organs and how that manifests and how that is best fostered. But the software in your mind, that is the ideas, that is something that is separate. And that's both from experience as you're growing up as a child, all the things and the impressions you see, learning and mimicking from other adults, whether you learn how to talk, learn how to walk. You have kids, I know you definitely have seen this. Those things are definitely learned behaviors, right? If you have a child that is raised without those things, like feral kids, they don't have all these, different types of mimetic impressions from those around them. So absolutely, the rearing takes a part, and genetics has a part too. But the question here that we're looking for specifically is whether or not people are able to have their thoughts changed by outside influences. The question is not whether or not, oh, hey, if you're with parents, you have a two-parent household and they model good, healthy behavior for you, and so you naturally want to adopt their politics a bit more because you had good parents, whether that's, a fixed thing. The question is, okay, well, even if they're modeled this way, or even if they have a proclivity this way, well, can you still change that? None of these studies that you're referencing have anything to do with that topic whatsoever. And I would say, from reading the questions myself, most of these sociologists don't even ask questions in a meaningful logical way that get to libertarian philosophy. They usually use binaries, right, in the political spectrum, the red, red, blue, that kind of thing, conservative, liberal. These things don't really explain what libertarian values do. And even like the things you're talking about with like open-mindedness, again, that might be a way to get the information in, but it doesn't tell you exactly what their values are in terms of how they actually process truth and how they actually process things about the world. And again, even people who are not very rational can get the basic principles pretty easily. As Patrick says, even people in Acapulco who are more like free-flowing spirits can get those things. But the way that you have these studies presented is, I think, a false causation. It's not relatable to the question of how you change minds. A better study, if you wanted to do that, would be, hey, let's study libertarians. Let's look at their history. Let's look at their parents. And okay, what did you come from before? What changed your mind? You study that, you might actually come up with a pattern of, there's a commonality, or maybe, there's a curve of different tactics or ways that people became libertarian. You might actually find what works the most. But that's not what any of these studies are actually doing. They're actually just really talking about what is a total package of environment. And I think that, even the perception issue here comes up, right? Because there's studies that have been done where it looks at whether a child is even aware of what their parents really know politically. And about 33%, this 1 in 3, didn't even know how to correctly identify their own parents' political beliefs. And again, this is on a continuum of how much attachment a child and the parent has, right? If a child has more attachment, that is, their parents mirror their emotions, they're physically present, they give them resources enough that they're good, you're going to have a positive correlated experience, which more likely leads, a child to more readily adopt what they have. But if you have a child who has really negative experiences, that's where you get your rebellious phase, right? And that's why very often in history, kids become relatively more liberal over each generation, and liberal in the mainstream sense. They tend to reject a little bit of the controls over time. So I think that's kind of really what I would say people should be thinking about, is not thinking about what are these potential limitations from what it is that someone grew up with. They should be saying, great, okay, who cares whether or not someone had some mix of genetic and epigenetic factors that make them similar to their parents. It should be, okay, well, what changes their mind? And that is not covered in those studies whatsoever. That has nothing to do with it.
Is the position so obviously I and Jack has too, certainly, and you probably have, even Jeremy, convinced people to become libertarians or anarchists. I'm sure that's happened to all three of us. Good on us, by the way. Pat on the back, all around. Is the position that the people that we were successful in doing that with we were successful because they were predisposed to accepting those positions in advance? And
yes,
and if that's the, and even if that's the position, that was part one. Part two is, even if that is true, we should still be doing the persuading, because prior to the persuading, people that were predisposed were not libertarians, right?
Yes. So on the second one, 100% agreement. I try to always make that point if given enough time, but I agree completely. And that's not, I'm making this point partially because I believe that there's a ceiling to what that is. But there's obviously a population out there, and trivially, if people don't hear the ideas, they're never going to believe in them. No one invented libertarianism in a vacuum, and even the most famous libertarians all built those ideas up, on people before that. So no question. And but I think the proper analogy actually is quite similar to what's going on with LGBTQ or sort of homosexuality or whatever you want to call it, where there's clearly some people with a pretty damn strong inclination, and these people just need the slightest. Oh wait, I can suck dicks. I love this, and then there are other people whom. Maybe they barely have the inclination at all. Maybe they don't have the inclination, but they're very agreeable types who happen. And so you see this, right? So this is why you obviously you see changes in attitudes. And so you can say, well, how much is the hardware sort of fit the algorithm? When the hardware fits the algorithm very well, it's going to be an easy sell. When the hardware doesn't fit the algorithm at all, it's going to be a nearly impossible sell. And so that would be a good analogy of my position. Definitely not that it's impossible. part of my own form of persuasion is sometimes to exaggerate things to get people to take my position a bit more seriously. But no, I'm not claiming that persuasion is impossible. I'm not claiming that people don't change minds, but I am claiming that it's something closer to homosexuality than we traditionally think of it as. And obviously people can be convinced to be gay, right? So I'm not, so certainly if you can convince people to be gay, I do believe you can convince them to be libertarian. But I think it's, roughly as hard.
So if you take the entire set of the population that is convincible, easily or more difficultly, what percent of the population do you believe is predisposed to being convincible at any degree, Jeremy?
So that's tough to say, because the next level of this way of thinking is that 80% of people, again, pulling a number out of my hat here, not going to really, but the majority of people are agreeable and simply just want to know what the rules are so that they can echo them back and agree with them, right? And so you have a bit of a catch-22 of how do you, and by the way, I think actually Jack, and so I'll let him answer later, but I think a lot of Jack's way of thinking is in line with this, where he's saying, well, the way you persuade people is you get other people to say it. And I think that's very true. That a lot of people aren't, this is why the people who are libertarians tend to be the very high openness, curious, systemizing types of people, because those are the kinds of people that are willing to entertain new ideas before others. But most people aren't that way. Most people are agreeable types who essentially want to kind of know what they're supposed to believe, and they want to believe it. And so certainly, if you could get enough people, the way to persuade them isn't through this kind of direct one-on-one conversation. They can only be persuaded by a kind of swirling around them or them hearing it from enough places. There's someone who I consider a friend of mine here who thinks that he persuades people to be libertarian when he does kind of a man on the street type stuff. And I don't think he's hurting people, but I think a lot of what happens, having seen some of it, is he talks to someone who's very agreeable. That person will have the conversation with them and go, oh yeah, that sounds really good. But that person will just agree with the next person they talk to 5 minutes later. I mean, that person is just and so this person, again, I'm not trying to discourage it. I support all kinds of activism. I never want to be dragging other people's activism. So that's not what I'm trying to do here. But like, I think that, it's easy to feel, you run into an agreeable person, it's easy to feel like you persuaded them, but that person will just agree with the next person they talk to as well, because they're not really carrying around a strong set of beliefs in their own head.
Jack, what percent of the population do you think are convincible? Is it 10% and we're fighting futility, or is it 100%? Where are you on that?
Well, if I want to just touch on one little predicate thing that I think really ties to this question. So I'd like to make a little comparison right now to Gen Z, right? And Gen Z has this exorbitant number of people who are suddenly identifying as, LGBTQ, rest of the alphabet, right? And we all know that historically, there wasn't as many people who would be this way, right? And in that context, we think about how in the schooling system, the state propaganda systems, we see the evidence of epigenetic factors of people propagandizing young people and getting them to think about it and dwell in it time and again, right? Constant visual cues, constant pushing, hey, what's your pronoun, this or that. So when you understand these contexts of how this propaganda works and how these systems work, I think it becomes a lot easier to see, especially with the studies you're talking about before, how that same type of Overton window exists for even the political beliefs that are really maybe not even that far apart in the left-right paradigm. I think that's a confounding variable, specifically because when you're talking about, well, how far left or right someone is in this sense, a lot of these people who are being surveyed are not exactly, political theorists and they've studied the world's ideas. These are people who have gone through the traditional public schooling system, gone on maybe to a regular old public university, and they have, the index card, the Tom Woods index card of allowable opinion, right? In the same way that you have the propaganda thing of allowable opinion that's happening in schools right now, where you're shifting the cultural waves with young people toward the LGBTQ critical race theory propaganda. So that same type of concept applies both with what we see today within that young person Gen Z context. It also applies within the political gamut of those tests of twins and other people in earlier contexts. And what you should take away from this is that the human mind is very malleable and young people are very impressionable. And that's precisely why it is so incredibly important to reach young people, high schoolers, people in college, before these things have been cemented within this kind of allowable opinion index. And they have all these different propaganda lines sitting there that we know, we deal with this all the time. But to us, this is like old news, right? Who will build the roads? Yeah. And just want the poor to starve and all this stuff, right? These are things that are built into their minds. They didn't come up with these things on their own. They were built into their minds specifically in school and by the curriculum and by the propaganda. And so in this context, I'm not really dealing with the question of, is there a number of libertarians out there? I'm dealing with the question of, okay, how do I undo this brainwashing, this trauma-based brainwashing on the population and get them to actually like, okay, holy crap, I've never actually thought for myself. I got to like think about this. That to me is a noble cause that transcends even the libertarian ideas, to get people to actually have a chance to grab hold of their own intellectual destiny and to take a moment to reflect and like, okay, where did I get that concept from? And when you mentioned like the video activism, people talking to people, ministry says that, I mean, we see that, in viral videos, you see comments and threads. A lot of times these interactions are not even about the immediate person, right? Sometimes I'll debate somebody, but I'm not really even debating for the sake of that person. It's for the people who are onlookers, who are reading and who are curious. And they're sitting there, they're not saying anything, they're not liking posts, they're just reading and thinking about what's being said. And they're getting that person has a much better argument. This person's, stupid, or, oh, wait, I didn't know about that fact. What the FBI blackmailed Martin Luther King Jr. What's this COINTELPRO stuff, right? There's things that you can wake people up with that don't require in the immediate moment having that full sail, thrust into libertarianism to get them there. You just got to get them on the path and get the ball rolling. And to me, I think that's where we're really looking at a much wider amount of the population that has that potential, because many of these people are just effectively drones from this trauma-induced brainwashing, right? We're not even really dealing sometimes with this person's conscious thought. We're dealing with the reactivity of that heavy school propaganda and the mass media and stuff like that. So sometimes it takes extra effort, takes work, but that is a noble thing to do, because if you do it especially in a public way, even if you don't get that person, you get the people who are actually there checking it out and just like perusing the threads. And that's why I love ratioing stupid Hollywood celebrities and, moms demand action, all this other stuff, because I'm not doing it for them. I'm not going to, change Shannon Watt's mind on gun control tomorrow, but a bunch of people are going to go and be like, what? I had no idea that New Hampshire had no gun laws, basically, and they had no mass shootings since 1982. What the heck is this? Why doesn't the media talk about this? I never knew, right? And that post I made got, beyond my own tweet, because got reshared, whatever, like maybe 2 million people to see that. So it's something that you do because there's a broader context of people that even in the moment people are talking to, they're not going to be changed, but there's a lot of people who will, because that one thing was the thing that they needed to see for them to go, wait, what? That's true? I can't believe this. And they start their journey. And that's just it. We got to start the journeys.
If you don't follow Jack on Twitter, you definitely should, everybody, because he's on like a jihad against idiot anti-gun takes. It's really a pleasure to watch. Good job on him. I fully support you in your jihad. What percent of the population, though, Jack? Are we fighting over 15% or 80%? What do you think?
I couldn't say, because it's not something to me that is even something that needs to be known. The only question is are you actually doing tactics that have a meaningful effect, right? The possibilities after are limitless when we find the tactics and the means. And again, that doesn't mean each of us individually is the best speaker for every context. I can't do what Maj Touré does. I'm not going to go to the hood and be like, yeah, hey guys, want to hear about libertarianism? No, like that's silly. I want him to do him well in his context. I want Jeremy in New Hampshire to kick butt there and to do him well. I want Patrick, I want you to do well in your context. So
let me press you on that. Let me press you on that one more time, and then I'll go back to Jeremy. But like, I think it matters greatly. If 80% of the population is convincible, then that changes our strategy and our end goal. If 10% of the population is convincible and 90% are a lost cause, then that should completely inform and change our end goal and where we're headed, and maybe even our strategy along the way. Like that might be a big concentration in New Hampshire versus try and convert the whole world type of data point. What do you think? Before I go back to Jeremy, Jack.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that number is not something I can know for sure because this is on a spectrum, right? Like convincing people is more than just flipping a switch, right? Potentially most all people could be, but it's really a matter of resources and ability, right? You can't, in just an economic sense, you're not going to be able to physically reach every single person. We know that, right? You're like, I'm going to be able to talk to 300 million people. No, obviously. But if you, as an individual, talk to a certain number of people and then they are changed and then they go on and so forth, right? You have an exponential effect. And I think that when you actually get down to people's, core values, and I think Larkin Rose does this very well. When you get down to people's core values, you can convince most people by appealing to their personal ethics and getting them to be consistent on those things. It's not hard. Most people are going to be like, yeah, theft's wrong, murder's wrong. Oh yeah, I don't want to be raped. Big surprise, right? It's just getting their personal ethics to be applied consistently. So, in that realm, I don't believe that most
that's impossible. We're not, sorry, but I'm sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted. That's rude. I do that too much. That's what's impossible then. Like people aren't designed to be consistent. People are literally designed to be inconsistent. We're evolutionarily designed to be inconsistent, to believe whatever's good for us in that moment. And this desire to build a logically consistent philosophy, it is why it's primarily interesting to this 1% to 2% of logical autistic people. Right? And by the way, I find it very appealing. I'm not like throwing a stone here. But literally, I do think we are biologically not designed to be consistent. And this desire for consistency is actually part of what makes libertarians a little bit weird.
I disagree. I think that, and I would want to actually break down the word consistency because I think that's too much of an abstraction. Like there's many contexts of consistency in order to actually like home in on what exactly you're speaking to. But if we're talking about consistent respect of one's body and property rights, that is universal. Every single person performatively does not want their body touched, violated, harmed without their consent. That is an absolute immutable logical truth that and you can be crazy and say, oh, whatever. You can speak performatively against that, but you cannot act outside of that. Consent is that key. And the more that we actually get people to really root themselves in that, then yes, you do get to consistency and you get people to value it subjectively because they empathetically relate to it. An empathetic relation is actually the most normal human experience you could possibly have, is actually thinking about others or feeling for others and relating about what you want for yourself and your community. That is about as human as it gets, is empathy and thinking through, okay, how do I want to be treated myself? Golden rule stuff. It is the statism lie and the manipulation where they create a two-tiered system. And that's all we're really fighting against by and large. We're not, for the most part, fighting against people trying to murder and rape everybody. We're fighting against people making one little exception to their moral code, the government. And once you get to that point, it is much easier to break it down. You don't need all the economics, you don't need all the philosophy to get to that core change. That consent is inescapable. Every person wants their consent respected. So to me,
I think you could have a bunch of conversations with people like that, and they would say exactly what you're saying, and then you'd say, well, why did you support vaccine mandates or mask mandates? And they'd just shrug their shoulders and not care. Because that's how most people are, and you're not going to, and you could get that person to feel that they were wrong if enough person told them wrong, but you could get them, they'll just logically, well, yeah, I guess I guess I did force them that, and they're not going to. Very, very few. The amount of people who you could actually get to see, well, like you said, you were against force. Isn't taxes force, or isn't this mandate force? And they'll either completely just swallow the fact that they've contradicted themselves and shrug their shoulders, or they'll just be like, well, I guess I'm okay with force then. They'll just walk back the claim that they don't actually have a problem with force. And by the way, this is another thing that is measurable. I agree that some of the data on libertarian beliefs is not particularly good because the things you might want to get asked aren't. But there's plenty of stuff around authoritarian beliefs, which would kind of be the opposite. And we do know that support for authoritarianism is a relatively stable personality characteristic. That is, like, people don't wildly change in how authoritarian they are throughout their lives.
And we also, like everything else, can kind of assume, slash maybe, I haven't seen actually a twin study that specifically mentions authoritarianism, but I would assume it, like everything else, it's the same. And so like there are a lot of people really are morally comfortable with forcing themselves on others. And you could get them to say, well, wouldn't you want that to not be done to you? But you're not going to actually change their comfort with exerting force on others.
Sure. And I'm not speaking to people who, for whatever reason, are going to be, dug in their positions. But the idea that people are dealing with discomforts or having slowly revealed revelations doesn't take away from the fact that people have changed, and that even with 2020, the lockdown, shutdowns, and the mandates, so many people had a wake-up call with that. So many people realized just how evil and bad the government could be. And I have personally witnessed across the spectrum, people suddenly getting in the mode of, oh, okay, that's why you really can't trust government. We got, never again. We don't want these lockdowns. We don't want these shutdowns. We don't want these mandates. This really killed, their business, their productivity, and things like that. You can't escape the effects of government central planning and violence. And very often, those are the things that are necessary predicates for people to change, is to have that pain that is so great that it motivates them to change. And I think that's why those in the government often try to cover up the bad effects of central planning, right? They'll just be like, oh, we'll print more money. We'll do this next bailout. They want to kick the can down the road because they know the second that pain hits, people act. And that's why you have a president, bad economy, while they're about to be, running, they're out. Because if the economy's bad and that pump is too high, people are pissed. So you have to have people getting pissed at the government and relating to why they are angry. You have to connect with those things. And I think that is just a part of that process. A lot of it is trauma related. It really is traumatic what people go through in schooling and how they have their interests, their wants, their needs put down, and how they're told, oh, what would you do if you're president, right? They get them to basically idolize central planning. They get them to want it and to lust after it and to imagine that they are themselves in the seat. So a big part of that is undoing the programming and the brainwashing there. I think that is much, an important part of this, as educating people on libertarian ethics and principles. But you have to get them waking up first. And that is its own separate discussion, its own discourse, and its own diversified means of actors and tactics, toward that end. And from what I've seen,
this is a rather, honestly, it's a rather Marxist view that all these people have this false consciousness, that is preventing them from sort of perceiving the true reality of their situation. I'm not sure that I will buy what I'm about to say totally, so maybe I'll be playing just a bit of devil's advocate here. But I think, at least it's closer to what it is, which is that most people are simply following their rational self-interest. Not necessarily economically rational, but a sort of socially rational and arguably more important self-interest. It's people are simply following their we're the irrational ones, kind of wasting our time and energy and money tilting at windmills. It's very easy to say that what most people are doing is very rational and even in their own self-interest.
Well, everybody acts within their self-interest. It's just the question of what is the context in which they're doing so. When someone is in, I think as Lysander Spooner said, a battlefield of not their own choosing, and they are voting because they don't want their neighbor to steal from them using the ballot box, we understand that action is not ideal, but they are reacting to those situations in their self-interest. I think that a big part of this is actually pushing back against those perverse incentives. That's exactly what we talk about. And we get people to connect with how the ballot box and how government specifically hurts them and their personal self-interest, whether it's family issues or their wallet or, what's going to happen with medical care. And it just is a matter of looking for what is most important with each individual, right? What is their gateway? And that's why kind of the work that me and my wife have done has often been with people that we really relate to and think that it's an easier sell, right? If you have someone who understands that gun rights should be absolute and you have this right to defend yourself, to me, that's a lower hanging fruit, right? Because it's easy to relate to them saying, hey, if you already get this for gun rights, think about this for the rest of property rights, right? You already get the government shouldn't take your guns and that you need this because the government's not always going to be there for you. Okay, great. Now, what about the rest? And we talk about how the government uses other regulations to go after guns and so on and so forth. You look for what is most pertinent to the person that you're talking to, the demographic you're talking to, and you relate it in that way. And I think that that's just the case for anybody. You're going to have different interests and different attention spans, but you have to look for what it is that is going to be most convincing, most relatable, empathetically to the person and the audience that you're talking to. And I think that those who have done that have been wildly successful. You know what I mean? I think of, just off the top of my head, I mentioned before, like someone like Eric July. He related to people in the comics community who were tired of the SJWing and the nonsense in the mainstream. So what does he do? Grinds every day, talks about the issues. But despite focusing on comic books, he still talks about liberty stuff. He still gets people, into that. And it's those little things, engaging in the culture, engaging in commerce, and providing solutions that makes you a beacon of light, that makes you someone who people want to learn from and look up to. And I did appreciate before he said, influencing the influencers, like helping to bring other people who have character, who have interesting projects to also be like-minded and multiply your efforts is absolutely fantastic, including, your own work in the cryptocurrency space and the platform space.
Sure. So let's, I'm curious. You said that you feel that COVID made many people more libertarian, and I guess I would agree with many in an absolute sense, because a small percentage of a large number is still a large thing. But my impression is actually that it's a relatively small minority that's still butthurt over COVID. Most people are mostly fine with it. Many governors who were COVID lockdown governors, went on to get reelected. And I don't think we've really seen there be any kind of, again, I'm sure we can point to people. COVID, for example, in the Free State Project, more people came here than ever before. So there's no question that it moved people. But it ideologically and physically. But the idea that this happened in mass. And I'd be curious. I couldn't find. I was actually just checking quickly to see what the support was. I know as of the summer of 2021 or summer 2022 that there was still plenty of support for mask mandates and vaccine mandates and lockdowns. And even though people had gone through all this stuff, they hadn't really changed their minds, at least according to survey data. So I'm pretty skeptical of this idea that COVID changed a lot of people's minds. I think COVID to me was a good example of, most people are actually pretty cool with authoritarianism. So we kind of experienced that one maybe a bit differently. So I thought maybe that was worth talking about more.
Sure. So, there's multiple aspects to that. And I would say that first and foremost, because of the lockdowns and shutdowns, it actually caused a massive polarization. If you look at the demographics of people who are moving out of the blue states, it's massive. We're talking in the realms of millions of people who ended up fleeing to states like Florida, Texas, New Hampshire, and other places that in the media have been promoted as being the dangerous states because they're open, right? Death, Santis, or whatever. So I actually see it as a polarization effect.
They call them Death Santis? That's hilarious.
Yeah, totally. But what I'm saying is, like, maybe you would agree with me here. Maybe this isn't what you're saying, but like, I would bet if you polled the American public, their COVID-20 is out or whatever, would you support a mask mandate? I bet we would see 50% or more, or pretty close to 50%, still being completely fine with that kind of thing.
It could be possible, but that wouldn't be my personal look to in terms of what it is that I am interested in terms of libertarian culture. I'm interested in how did people who may have been kind of ambivalent or on the edge, or who maybe have been a little bit conservative, how did they get radicalized, right? Because when we're talking about the economics of mind change, if you have people who before weren't activated and all of a sudden you get millions of people like, this is evil. I can't believe this. And now they're with their minds and their dollars supporting people like FLCCC and other organizations that are pushing back against this. That's radical, because you can't just simply look at it in terms of people moving and those mind change. You also have to look at it in terms of support for organizations and monetary, right? And that is huge, because when you have that type of shift, when you have that parallel economy shift, well, now you're actually feeding the change even further. And that is such an important aspect of libertarian cultural growth, is that you want to have those changed minds. You want to have people to take it seriously, be like, oh, I got to go support, whatever it is that is fighting whatever restrictions, whether it's FPC on gun stuff or Institute for Justice or whatever. You want people to suddenly get active, right? And from not active to maybe, whatever Republican, paleoconservative are all say to being like, never again, I'm throwing my money at whoever's going to stop this. That is monumental. So that's the types of changes that will change things for years to come in the general scape of the places where they become more liberty oriented. Like, for example, Florida, the demographics have changed so much that we're talking about 20, 30 years of permanent change, simply because when DeSantis ran before, he like barely won against Gillum, who fittingly enough, was found naked and coked out with a gay hooker despite being married. So that didn't help him. But it went from, barely that 50-50 to him having over 60% support and growing, right? So you're seeing this polarization in America, and what is an ideal, and I think is also a win for you, is you want that polarization to net benefit you. You want the people who are mad to come to New Hampshire and who has said enough is enough, something's got to change. You want those things. So I think in terms of mind change, not just in binary, but in spectrum, and whenever I see that Overton window shift, that sparks my joy, my interest, because I'm like, wow, you didn't have this back when I was younger. You didn't have, Republicans saying abolish the ATF or, being for marijuana decriminalization, legalization didn't exist. It was like, you go back like 2000, it was like put gay people in jail and, keep up Texas's sodomy law that was overturned in 2003, right? It is a complete paradigm shift that we have seen in the cultural values as we're moving on this spectrum of, you could say, the mainstream center-left to conservative to libertarian spectrum, and I think even Tim Pool and his audience and what he's done to bring in that voice is such a wonderful evidence of that. And the successes of Michael Malice and Dave Smith, people that you wouldn't even believe, 20 years ago, if you're like, yeah, we have anarcho-capitalists on, coming on Fox News, you'd be like, what are you talking about? What?
Milton Friedman had a show called Free to Choose on mainstream television in the 1980s. They're seen by millions of people. And I mean, support for libertarianism broadly also appears to have be down from a peak in the late 90s or early 2000s, although there's certainly plenty of support for it today. I'm not trying to say it's like dead or something, but like if you attempt to measure, among Americans' political perspectives, I agree that there's a minority of people that did move. And by the way, I support this kind of political polarization. Again, this would be probably a difference between ours, because I see people as having different ethical foundations that are difficult, that are challenging to change. I see it as morally better to let people separate themselves. And so I don't care if people want to live in this way that wouldn't fit my own ethics, because they have genuinely different ethics that are based off of a different foundation than my ethics. And so I'm not interested in trying to convince them that they're living in some wrong way or something like this. But yeah, I guess this is definitely one where, and it would be nice to try to find some data on this, although I also don't have any off the top of my head, but like, it definitely, my impression is it's a small minority. Yes, COVID did shake things up more than ever before, but on an absolute scale, you're talking about a couple percent, maybe 5 to 10% of people who really changed their lives in response to COVID. Shakeups, again, yeah, you can have these big events and shake up a small percentage of people, but most people are going to kind of remain where they are.
All right, Jack, I'll let you respond to that, and then I want to push Jeremy and put a head on this, and maybe move on to the next cultural issue that just popped up because it's kind of apt. So go ahead, Jack.
Sure. So again, when it comes to this idea of changing minds and political change, we always have to keep everything in context of the fact that politics, by and large, is run by a very small, relative to the general population, oligarchy. So we're dealing with an apparatus that isn't really, of the people, unlike what those of the government would like us to believe. We're dealing with kind of a small contingent of people who really are the main seats of influence and the main seats of political power. So when it comes to effect for the Change for Liberty, my goal is always both impact for what you're doing, as well as generally changing minds in a sustainable way. So what I would point to is that if anyone was concerned about wasting time because they think, oh, I'm just not going to have as much of an impact, if I'm just talking to regular Joe Schmoes. I think the more important part to actually reach out to would be to people who are influencers or people in that mid-level of culture change, where you want to get them on board because they have a larger audience and can have a bigger impact than you can alone. So sometimes just whatever it is, just getting that super chat statement, taxation of staff, or a book about liberty, just anywhere, just that little bit of something to get someone to think about it has a very big ripple effect impact on other people, especially where you have someone who already has built an audience. Again, just talking about Tim Pool before, just having all those different people who are in the liberty spectrum come on is just absolutely massive. I can't understate how big that is in terms of what those ripple effects are, down the road. So, to me,
would you be willing to make any so I'm skeptical. This is one where I would disagree. I think it's great. I love it, by the way. I'm not against it. I think it's awesome. But I'm skeptical that Tim Pool and these types of people are going to lead. So, and I was on Tim Pool. He's a good guy, definitely an ally. But what the idea that, so is there anything that you would predict? Because I'll tell you, my prediction is certainly that America isn't going to get more libertarian, that people are going to basically believe the same things that they believed, 5 to 10 years ago as a whole, and the government's just going to get bigger. But you think that we're on the tip of a libertarian shift because of this?
So when I talk about libertarian shifts, I'm talking in the comparative of what is historically. We're talking about where the total cultural reference was 20 years ago, and then to this day. We're talking about, in reference to that. I'm not sure how exactly long it will take to have a much bigger influence, but I can tell you that the growth, if you look at it, between what you had available in culture, in content, in media, in influence, go back 20 years and then go to today, and you see those ripple effects of the Ron Paul Revolution movement and who that inspired, and then those people and who they inspired, and you can keep going down this chain, and you will see that there is a burgeoning, growing libertarian movement that has made it to the notice of those in state power, to the point that they'll even run hit pieces on Anarchapulco, or NBC Boston will try to do a little hit piece on Free State Project. Again, people are taking notice because it is taking root and it is taking effect. But at the same time, those in the state, when they see this, they don't like it. You think they're just like, oh, those libertarians are really winning. No, we should just let them go. What did they do? They're like, oh, okay, we got to shut them down. So they shut everybody down, right? Remember 2017 and so forth? They started to go after all the big channels, and they started to shut down all these different content creators because like, oh, well, that's a right-wing echo chamber, right? The government knows they're losing the cultural battle. They know they're losing the argument, and the sentiment against them is so great, and leading up to even, the Epstein case, right? Everybody knew Epstein didn't kill himself, right? Cultural phenomenon, right? Everybody's like, yo, the government's corrupt. But they didn't have at that time a formulated direction of where to put all that energy. And the government used, of course, their Event 201 planning. And then, of course, what happened with the pre-Great Reset and all the lockdowns and shutdowns to then collapse on the global protests against government. And I don't forget that. I don't forget how far things came before the government's like, no, we got to stop this, right? So they are scared. They are concerned. And this pushback is happening across the board, both locally and culturally, and even at state levels, right? Where you have legal tender laws being passed in states like Utah and Arkansas and so forth, where they're pushing back against the central bank digital currency and saying, yeah, we're going to have gold, silver, no taxes. We're going to have this become a resistance to that and the federal government's inflation, right? You have to look at the multiple angles of attack, the multiple ways of changing people, and the multiple ways to influence culture, and just appreciate that, okay, not everything may be you as an individual if you're watching this, but just think, what is your talent? Where do you stick out? Where can you stand? And take your stand, right? You don't have to do everything. You just have to do something that makes sense for you. And the ripple effects from that can be beyond what you can possibly imagine. You really have no idea who you're going to influence, and that chain, causal relationship will lead to. And that's really what we've seen today is those chains of causal relationships, on the shoulders of giants and people being influenced and growing. That's what we see today. We're now, you have cool things like the Free State Project having a 20th anniversary, right? You have, cryptocurrency and the idea of privacy and thinking outside the Federal Reserve System, a normalized thing, right? A mainstream thing. You have major people talking about government corruption and censorship. Elon Musk, whether you like him or not, whatever, he's out there talking about what the government's covering up, right? People are like, oh, okay. People are having this cultural change.
The Free State Project is a response to 50 years of libertarian failures. And again, these things are measurable. And I just don't think there's any data that shows that on the whole, the American electorate is getting meaningfully more libertarian. I think there is data that shows that people are sorting themselves out. So some of the great things that we are seeing are a result of that. I do agree that we are seeing some states do better things we've ever seen before. And I certainly would, of course, argue that New Hampshire is leading the charge there. But that's a result of polarization, of people separating themselves because persuasion isn't working. And so people are going, hey, I can't persuade my neighbors. I should go to where there are more people like me. And so I do see that happening. I think that's a great and positive change. But this idea that in mass that opinions are actually changing, I don't think there's much evidence to support that.
Well, I'm not saying that there's in mass 90% of Americans. I am saying that when you go through time and you actually look at the growth, it is absolutely significant. And we're talking in the millions, possibly tens of millions at this point of people who would readily self-identify as having libertarian values, even if they didn't fully express it. We're talking about people who are in the non-voting category, which is literally the plurality of eligible voters. Because if it's like me, I don't vote. I'm not registered because I don't want my stuff on the public record.
I agree a lot of natural libertarians aren't voters. And by the way, there was a point that got confused the other day, but I don't need to go in between you and me. It's not about. It's about where you don't need people to vote. You can ask people about their support for economic redistribution, about what they would how egalitarian they are, how much they want to use force to stop various social beliefs. These things really are measurable. And so while there's evidence that Americans are getting more socially liberal, I don't think there's really any evidence that Americans are getting more economically conservative or libertarian, if you prefer that word there. But
I think that there's a number of framing errors in the studies that you reference, including both the question framing, the demographics selected, and the way that they're actually driving their charts. In terms of how they're actually placing these things that belie the
that this is happening, but there's no way to measure it. There's no measure there's no social survey. There's nothing that measures American opinions over time that you feel could be used to tell whether these things are true or not.
No, I think that the questions and the framing that's used is not accurate to telling you exactly what people really believe in terms of the questions are here's an example, one that was recently I was posting on one of the ones you actually posted. They said, according to their spectrum in this chart was, Trump, Hillary, and other. One of the questions was, how much American pride do you have? Is that telling you how much you're a libertarian? No.
Sure,
you could be American pride if
I have no problem. I'm sure there's one or two questions on that survey that's not great, but you can throw those out and it's still going to be pretty good. I mean, and if you don't like that one, you can find plenty of other ones. I didn't do a deep dive on that one. I saw someone else post it and I reshared it. But I think I've never seen one. I've never seen one that shows it. We've had our best libertarian politicians, run. We've seen Ron Paul run. We've seen the Libertarian Party do its thing for a long time. We've seen the ideas exist for multiple generations and be argued by people way better at it than anyone on this call. And the ceiling, and again, the ceiling here would reliably be 10 to 20%. And even with Ron Paul's group that he got, how many of these people went on to be Bernie supporters or went on to be other things? Now, I agree. Ron brought more people to the libertarian movement than anyone, more people that are still here than anyone. So it's not a drag on Ron, but it's that, because again, your best communicator is like the hottest gay guy, right? So he can pull people that are like the least likely, right? But those people are the people who are also going to slide back if they're not, reliably having the information. And by the way, we'll see this same thing with the prediction. By the way, with the LGBTQ stuff, you're gonna see the same thing. A lot of these kids who are on the fringes of being able to they're getting persuaded into identifying as it, and in 5 to 10 years they won't. That's what I would predict. And so you can do the same thing with liberty. Your best communicator can get that number up. Maybe you can hit that 15 to 20 number, but some of those people are going to slide back anyway.
Sure, of course, it goes with anything, right? You're going to have people changing views at that time. But again, bring it back to the main focus. The question is what type of messaging breeds that type of long-term sustainability? And it's only been in recent history that we've even had any meaningful shot at this in terms of mass media, mediums, and communicators, right? We are at this cusp, and we have seen that the government has been desperately trying to quell it and to put it down. So to me, I personally, having seen the metrics of many of the top creators, we're talking like Jason Bassler at the Free Thought Project, Anti-Media, Carrie Wedler, many other people who were specifically shut down and censored, who would have the most incredible, unbelievable impacts on people, right? The impacts are there. It's just a matter of getting around this current corporate government social censorship regime that we faced because of our success. And I say our, in not some collectivist kind of sense, I say in terms of literally the activists here, you guys included, who have been a part of that change and that sustainable change. And I don't see that, in just pure political terms, because I know you're often talking about, well, who's voting for what, who's in the Libertarian Party. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about attitudes towards the state. I'm talking about resistance to the state. I'm talking about thinking outside the state. And the more that we have those people, regardless of whether they choose to vote, register LP, or make a protest vote, I don't care. The more that we're having people who are supporting these parallel structures that before could not have been sustained. You could not have sustained what we have today in terms of some alternative, forms of thinking outside the government, all the way from Silk Road and Bitcoin to today, looking at like Era July and Riververse and other types of projects that are in the liberty sphere that could not have sustained the support and the funding in the past. It just didn't exist. So I think that we actually do have it, but we are facing some of the greatest battles of our time between the government eroding our wealth, which obviously takes an impact when the government, prints like most of the money ever made, which is killing people, and is literally censoring and had been censoring for the longest time, dissident voices against the state, as we saw very clearly, thanks to the Twitter files making that mainstreamed that, hey, the government does want to censor all these people who are, talking out against their narrative. So I personally think that what we see often with these studies and what we see often with these framings is an intentional slated bias against libertarians and a coordinated effort to discount the effect of people's minds being changed and the success of that, because they don't want us to win. They don't want you to win. Clearly, what you think the SEC was like, yeah, Jeremy Kauffman, let's let him win. No, they're like, we're shutting this guy down. We're shutting him down.
Let me interrupt real quick.
You're facing a horrible triangle. Yeah.
Actually, you guys, my wife just messaged and said she was in a car accident, so I'm a little distracted. Just making sure that they're okay. So yeah. If you guys are cool going back and forth without me, I'm going to pay attention to this for a couple minutes.
Please,
Is that cool?
All right. If you just turn it off, by all means, then totally deal with your.
It's your show for give me 5 minutes. It's your show. Have fun.
All right, let's talk about Patrick behind his back. Okay.
I thought you were going to talk about the Jews. That's all that's left.
Yeah, let's talk about how nice he is. Actually, let's say, he's such a nice guy, but I don't want him to hear it. I don't want to, because I'd be gay. So we have to talk about how great he is, but only when he can't hear it. There we go. I do hope everything is okay, though. I don't mean to joke about a potentially serious situation. Where was I? So I was just Googling, some various, trying to find some stats on some of this stuff, and percent support for economic redistribution has been going up, nearly year after year for almost 100 years. Percent support for various, welfare programs, military, et cetera. I guess, again, you can find social areas, drug legalization, et cetera, where you could argue that America has gotten more libertarian. At least economically, I struggle to find many, if any. And so this idea that, we'd be winning if not for these relatively new things, as far as I can tell, the country has been getting less libertarian for forever, and certainly for decade after decade after decade, since the early 1900s. And so I guess, this idea, it would be nice, like everything you're saying. Hey, it'd be nice if there really was this undercurrent, and it's about to be tapped. But I guess I worry that's a little bit of a cope. That it's a nice belief. We wish it was true. We want it to be true. Let me be very clear, Jack. I hope you're right and I'm wrong. To be clear about all of this, I hope you're right, and I don't want you to stop doing what you're doing for a second. Let me also be clear about that. So I'm not trying to discourage anyone or that kind of thing. I am, of course, trying to sell an alternate strategy, which is that there's enough of us to win today. There's enough of us to have a homeland today if we simply join forces and work together, and we don't have to try to persuade 330 million people. And part of my prediction is that we will see the people of New Hampshire be persuaded, because how real persuasion actually happens is by having that sort of by creating that kind of echo chamber. And that's actually part of what we're doing here. So we can make sure that we monopolize every social media comment thread, and we can make sure that, because we're a third of the state house, our opinion is going to get mentioned on TV, even if it doesn't get as much airtime, et cetera, et cetera. So, but this, I really want to believe the national thing is real. I just can't find. It doesn't match my actual personal experience, and it doesn't match data that I can find either. So I just ultimately end up not believing it, not because I don't want it to be true, but just because it just doesn't appear to be.
So let me put a therefore what on this to both of you. I'll start with Jeremy. So it sounded like the video that kicked off this discussion was primarily redressing the Libertarian Party's efforts. But it also sounds like maybe you have a critique for libertarians at large as well. So the question is, if you are right about everything that you've said so far, therefore what? Like, to me, a content creator, a liberty activist, I do street activist events where we do charity events and we constantly talk about libertarian ideas. We make videos, we write philosophical discourses and manifestos, and I do all this stuff. What should I do differently than I currently am? What should Jack do differently? What should the general public do differently? What's the therefore behind what your position is?
Well, if I'm correct, then we can't win by persuading enough Americans to win via the democratic process for America writ large. There are, however, more than enough of us, easily tens of millions of us, which is a lot of people, and it's a large planet, and so we should be able to succeed in some way. I do. So to me, it's about finding as many of these people together, bringing them together, and I certainly think physically co-locating and taking over local government or taking over state, like we're doing here in New Hampshire, I think that's the way to go. I think that's the most feasible method that's been tried. It could potentially be done in other ways. Maybe a bunch of libertarians can get together and buy an island. Maybe a bunch of libertarians can raise a military and take over a small African country. It doesn't have to be the Free State Project, I don't actually endorse taking over a country militarily. But the point is, you got to do something different, is really what I'm trying to say with that point, is that if it's true that it is that the majority of Americans aren't going to be persuaded to be libertarian, but there are still a lot of us, then there should still be a path to victory. Another potential path to victory at the national level, people hate this one, but I'm going to give it to you guys anyway, because I don't mind giving ideas that are unpopular, would be to kind of to push for a special status. I don't mean like literally carve out, well, kind of I do, I guess, like getting people to recognize that, all right, you might not share our beliefs, but we really hold them sincerely. We're willing to fight for them. So at least respect us with your laws. So let me opt out of Social Security. Okay, so 98% of Americans support Social Security, but libertarians, those weirdos, we really should allow them to opt out, and then we should let them starve in the streets if they're poor when they're old or whatever. Like getting or finding ways that, if you're talking about nationally, that's the only way I could see it happen, is getting some way of, or just being militant enough, being that really loud minority that they have to cave to you. I think maybe that could also work. But no, really, I think the most promising attitude is to say, look, there's a lot of us. We believe these things. Let's get together. Let's create a libertarian place, or let's take over a small state or a town, and let's make that place libertarian, because I think that's much more feasible than the 170 million people realm.
So you're not telling me to stop what I'm doing. You're just telling me to do it from a different location.
I do think you should do it from New Hampshire, but you guys in particular actually you're trying to do national stuff. You're trying to get big attention. And so that, I want to be really clear. I think that's helpful. If there's someone who I'd say you're kind of wasting your time, it's actually more the person who's like running their LP in Chicago, their local LP in Chicago. I'd be like, look, man, I do think I appreciate what you're doing. I think it's good that you're doing it. And as I said, I really don't want to crap on people's activism because most people do nothing. So anyone doing anything is doing more. So, but I think that those kinds of people could be more effective by coming to a place like New Hampshire.
All right, Jack, I think, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I really think the Libertarian Party as a party is worse than not having it at all. Like, I think it actively hurts the liberty effort. And my case for that is it's like a honeypot. It sucks in people with free time and a drive to be an activist, and they want to change the world, and they have a little bit of time to devote to trying to make the world a better place. And rather than going out and doing things that might actually make a difference, they join the party and they get caught up in political debates and Robert's Rules weekends where they just shit away 3 days of their lifespan arguing just incessant nonsense. I find it to be a honeypot. So my challenge to you is kind of the same question, but it's also just like, therefore what, from your position, what should I or we be doing differently than what we are now?
Sure. So for me, generally, just a quick note, my position isn't like, libertarians or something like that are going to win at the federal government level. That's not my position. My position is more so of a cultural influence with politics downwind from that, which means that it doesn't matter, which party or this or that or which state. The goal is to make it unpopular for those in the government to push status things, right? And that's why I want to convince everybody, even if you identify as Republican, I'd rather you be someone who's like, yeah, no war, we need to decriminalize whatever, legalize whatever. I'd rather, have that than just be like, I'm going to identify as libertarian and name only and not do anything. So my goal is always about principled mind change. But when it comes to what people are actually doing, I always like to think of it in terms of their own subjective interests and preferences, because I don't know what's best for each person. I can only, say, hey, there's some needs in different areas, or like, hey, people in the gun community definitely need more libertarian minded people. I like influencing in that way and getting them to start to move in that direction. But each person has unique skills. They have unique passions. They have unique things that are going to make them want to get up every day and do stuff. And for the LP in particular, I definitely agree that there's things with the LP, especially going the past LP, that were nonsense and not helpful to the message of liberty. And I like the changes that have been made so far. I think that for me, what I see the LP as in terms of being its optimal vehicle, it's an opportunity in the incrementalism for people who are moving down the pipeline of moving out of the left-right paradigm and starting to like challenge their political sensibilities. It's an opportunity for them to have a type of political community where they can actually get exposure to the ideas and meet people and network and do things, and possibly even coalition for things that are more reasonable to do, whether it's a local issue, maybe it's a local change in law, or a state amendment ballot issue. I think that there are incremental things for liberty that are wonderful and great, and any type of liberty we can get in our lifetime, I want to have. And that means cutting the government, getting the government out of our lives and wallets, whatever is possible, all means possible, that as long as it's otherwise ethical. So that's what I see the LP as being in its optimal form. And its optimal form, someone who comes to the LP has the opportunity for community. They get to hear great speakers and lectures on economics. They get to hear, great speakers on ethics, and they actually start to get moved down that pipeline to becoming principled. And for me, that is what it was for me. When I was in college libertarians, when I was in undergrad, it was an opportunity for me to hear ideas and to talk with people about things that I would never get otherwise. I wouldn't get this in my regular classroom. I wouldn't get this just in the campus generally. It was a place for people to come together and talk about these issues and to really help educate and mentor those. And I think that I would recommend, for those who are in the LP, that they should have that as a focus, that it should be about education, ethics, and economics. It should be about mentorship. And then if politics comes with that, if it comes, to a point where, people are just trying to raise awareness or like coalition for an issue, for a ballot thing, then wonderful too. But you need to have that sustainable base no matter what. Otherwise, you are going to just have turnover and bickering and fighting over stupid stuff, with Robert's rules and other things. You're going to have just people who are there trying to make themselves feel important by having something to do. And that's not what we want anywhere. I mean, LP or not, you don't want people who are just want to fill a role. You want people who are passionate and principled and want to be peaceful parents, and they want to, educate others and inspire and feel inspired and change things in the economy. You know what I mean? You want builders, you want creators, you want people who are actually going to be a part of this incredible revolution for peace. So, I think that's just something that applies in all contexts. That's the ultimate goal. We really want people to be encouraged, inspired, mentored in these values and to become strong in it. Because again, even as Jeremy said, if someone is, I'm like more libertarian leaning, that doesn't mean they're principled. I mean, we see tons of people who are like, yeah, I'm libertarian. And then all of a sudden their pet issue comes up and, time for some state violence, right? It's just not true. They need education. Even people who are like there 90% of the way still need that little bit of help. Otherwise, as always, the government's going to have the opportunizing of using people's one little pet or two little pet issues and, capitalize on that, right? They're going to capitalize on what little bit of statism they have every time. And we've seen it time and again. So we need that education, even for the remnant of the free staters in New Hampshire.
Okay,
yeah.
So
I actually think that last thing you said, just I'll be welcome. And
no,
actually describes
one sec. Last call for questions, everybody. I'm taking questions on Odysee. If you're not watching on Odysee, there's a link in the description wherever you are watching it. Put your questions there for myself or either of our guests, and then I'll let Jeremy finish what he was saying while you guys are typing your questions, and we'll spend a few minutes on that, and then we're gonna, I think, wrap up soon here, guys. So sorry, Jeremy, go ahead.
Totally. I was just going to comment that you were saying about, hey, they're not principled. I think some of what you see happening inside of the LP and some of what the current leadership wants to do, and they've said this explicitly, right? We want to have a sort of more populist. We're trying to tap the remnant. We're trying to get these people. And I think they're right that there is this undercurrent of people out there with libertarian inclinations. As you said, a lot of them tend to not vote in the first place. That's another thing I completely agree with, by the way. But what's going to happen is they're not going to be as philosophical. They're not going to be as intellectual, right? And you can see this causing some of the strife inside of the LP, where you've got a sort of old guard that actually was more intellectual. And obviously there's plenty of intellectuals in the sort of new wave of people. I'm not trying to say that as a whole they're dumber, but that's not what I'm saying at all. But they're bringing in people who aren't as intellectual. And then the intellectual old guard is like getting frustrated and fighting with them rather than trying to educate them. And so I do wish that there was more of an effort to say, hey, these people have liberty inclinations. They might be saying something that's like sort of silly by your standards, but this could be a chance for you as an old head to be teaching them principles instead of, fighting them.
Yeah, I agree there that I think entryism is absolutely needed for libertarian organizations generally, and it's actually a big mistake. And this was a failure of the LP before and some other orgs to think that, if someone comes in the door, you have a pulse, let's run them as a candidate. I mean, that's, I won't use the word because I'm not sure if I'll get struck on YouTube, but it's self-destructive, right? To do such things ends up hurting you in the long run because they're going to flake and they're going to do wrong things. And I 100% agree with you that it should always be we welcome everybody culture, just like FSP, but it should always be, hey, but you got to prove your principles and you got to show you're consistent in and out before you're accepted into a position of some type of leadership within, again, any organization. And that anyone who does otherwise is just building a house of cards that is going to be destroyed. And I completely agree with you that the education, economics, and the entryism is absolutely critical for LP and for, again, any liberty org. Do not neglect that mentorship and, kind of a discrimination discernment there.
Okay, I have a couple questions here, and then do you guys have 15 more minutes for that other topic, or do you need to go? Let me know.
I can do if you need.
I got 15 to 20 minutes total. So
Got it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to answer these questions, but before we do, I'm going to shut off the YouTube stream because the other topic we're going to talk about is not one that the nanny assholes at YouTube would probably like us talking about. So if you are watching the stream on YouTube, the stream is about to end, but the stream is going to continue over on Odysee and Rumble. So there's a link in the description. You can watch this exact same stream happening right now over on Odysee. Click that link and you won't miss the rest of this discussion. We're going to talk about a little spicy topic and answer the questions that I got from you guys on the stream so far. Okay, so goodbye, YouTube.